And just test that. Okay. So my first question is about this idea of a fundamental movement pattern. Can you explain, when you talk about the fundamental movement patterns, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, I suppose it doesn't exist as a pattern in that sense that you have this absolute pattern of movement, because everybody's different. But I think what you look at are patterns which have emerged through function: running, jumping, skipping, all those things. So we have examples in everyday life where we, in order to survive, we have these patterns of movement: walking, standing, running, jumping, climbing. And within those patterns themselves are, if you like, reflex patterns, reflexes, which support the motor function, so that you can do it at a reflex level, so you can function without having to think about it. So you have cross-extensor, extensor thrust, withdrawal reflexes, and a whole bunch of other reflex actions which will support natural, which you could term natural movement, but again, it isn't a definable. It's not something you can define. And it's better, in the sense, to draw on those patterns which were already established and build on those patterns and modify and refine those patterns, than introduce another pattern. So it would be easy if, for example, those patterns had already been adapted to, say, playing football. It would be better to reference a soccer kick, in the sense of a kick, or not. That doesn't mean everybody goes out and plays soccer, but you could introduce, say, kicking a ball as a start point if you wanted to introduce a pattern and the person was having difficulty in understanding, say, a round kick, to introduce kicking a ball and adapt that to a combative aspect, than actually coming up and trying to describe this other pattern, which you now break down and theoretically make up, break down and reconstruct, which you're now having to think about, whereas the other one, you've been doing that since you were a kid, perhaps. So it's and with myself, I've always built strongly around walking patterns, because within the pattern itself, this triplanar movement, it's a multifunctional, it's multidimensional in a sense. Everything is working.
It's coordinated.
Coordinating. And it's a great way to start as your reference point, as a starting point for punching, kicking. It's hard to see, but it's what I've done for 40 years plus.
Now, I can think of a number of occasions when you've been trying to show someone how to improve their punch, and you got them to throw a ball at the wall, and then go and do the shot on the bag. Is that the kind of thing that we're talking about?
Yeah, basically. If somebody's having a problem understanding the concept, it wouldn't mean that everybody in the gym starts throwing balls at walls and smashing balls and round or whatever it is, but as a concept to try to understand and get beyond this other thing, which is very technical and has been arranged in such a way that it makes sense, because it's constructed.
So this other thing that you're talking about is where someone says, move your arm like this, hold your shoulder like that, release at this moment, at this level, at this range, this very detailed technical breakdown of a move.
I'd rather look for examples of movement with regards to kids and top athletes, because usually what happens is that the top athletes were kids, obviously.
Hopefully.
but what I meant by that was that they've trained since they were kids, so that the patterns haven't become prescribed, they haven't become motor orientated.
Yeah.
Although refinement might take place at some level where a coach comes along and just tweaks the move, rather than takes the child and makes the move. That's what usually happens.
So this is another term here, this idea of motor-oriented.
Yeah.
Can you just break that down a little bit, what that means?
That's when you're trying to consciously put together the move.
Okay.
That's when you have elements of move. When you can be given a tip, and you're aware of a tip of maybe how a motor event or a moving part might contribute better to the performance, or how the way you're doing it might be inhibiting the performance in some way or detrimental to the performance. So you could be focused on that as an element you need to correct. But when you're trying to put all the moving parts together to construct them in the way that it's been prescribed, it's impossible. And so what you usually end up with, you can only bite so many chunks of that off at a time, and you end up with only being able to juggle a few balls, when in actual fact there's a lot of balls in the sense of movement, of skeletal movement, and joints and actions that need to be juggled, and you're going to drop them. Or you're going to over-focus on one at the expense of the others.
I was thinking of the idea of like the double hip.
Yeah, it becomes a very emphasis, and that becomes a typical example of a motor-orientated response, where a function has been observed and then taken apart, broken down, and then in the lab, but left in the lab.
Right.
And now everybody's practicing the double hip, as it were, as an isolated movement, which is very robotic. That's why I call it exaggerated, and it's overemphasized to the detriment of the whole movement.
I mean, do you think that some of this is possibly an explanation for the concept of beginner's luck? That sometimes when you just first have a go at something, you actually do better, and once you start trying to learn it...
That's usually the case. So there's a lot of examples where people will do what is natural for them to do, like the way they might lift their weight off the floor. They might just do it all wrong. But in actual fact, sometimes it's all right, because that's how people do it. It's usually when people then come in with a uniform, prescribed way of doing things, which fits vertical alignment, which fits aesthetics, which fits simple function. And now what you end up with, you've actually denied benefits of evolution.
Yeah.
So to end up with this thing which is now being defined to you when you have a wisdom of the body which is already defining it. You're doing it every day.
So going back to the functional patterns, if the idea is that there are these reflex patterns that are laid in and they've been modified in childhood to do these simple, well, not so simple, but actions like walking and crawling and climbing, that it would be better to just tweak that a little bit than to try to reinvent the wheel, as it were.
Yeah, and as you're not being told, those functions of everyday life, you're not actually going out to walk in a particular way, you're just walking.
Right.
It's a function. You need to get from here to there, you walk, or you run, if that's the case.
So we're back to the idea of doing something because of what you have to do to serve a purpose, rather than
a reason other than the motor orientation.
Right.
And that the reason usually becomes a motor orientation, and so that becomes the focus of the training. If I do this right, to
satisfy the teacher or to satisfy the form,
then I must have satisfied some criteria, but which is going to make me a better fighter. It's just coming at it out of that face. It's doing the swimming outside of the pool.
Right.
Rather than finding out what the water feels like and what's the balance and dynamic buoyancy within the pool, you're trying to experience that you can't do it. You've got to get in there. You have to be involved in function, because that's the only way you can get a feedback as to whether or not your intention is being satisfied and gratified. You can't do it any other way. Whereas you're satisfying the movement, that's when it becomes can become aesthetics, and you can start then having the peak shift effect where you're actually over-focusing and getting gratification for exaggerating a movement which you're being asked to perform, or you feel is important to the movement, like a hit. That's the rats in the maze.
We'll maybe talk about the rats, but you mean basically over-stylizing something.
Over-stylizing something because you believe that's
important.
And as it becomes more important, it becomes even more exaggerated, more over-stylized.
Okay. Great. Thank you.